It's nice to see everyone here on this gorgeous Sunday morning. A little bit cooler. The sun is shining in the morning. What more could we ask? Our speaker this morning is someone I've known since grade school, Eastham Elementary grade school. Yeah, no, just the other day. And she is the archivist and curator at the Schoolhouse Museum of the Eastham Historical Society, and also of the Daley Swift. What's the Swift Daley? Okay, that was the Swift Daley Tool Museum, which you've passed the sign on Route 6 a million times, and are certainly welcome to stop in. She can tell you more about that. But today, her focus is on the life-saving services at Nauset. So without any more ad-libbing here, I'm just going to welcome Marca Daley to our program. Please welcome her. Thank you.
Good morning. I have to tell my computer that I know I'm being recorded. They tell me everything that is happening. You have to say, got it. So I have it. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm going to be talking about the oceanside because the need for life-saving services on the oceanside was great. And so this is a short history and a short overview of those. And I'll be telling you where I got my information from the archives and from others in Eastham, because I think it's really important that people know how you come by your information, and then it's easier to judge that information as to its reliability or not. And so I'll be actually acknowledging some of the dates here that I'm unsure of, so that I went with dates that were given in the particular sources that I used. I use the Eastham Vacationist Handbook quite often. It was started in 1950s, and my grandmother was on that committee, along with many other Eastham people. But they have little tidbits of information hidden among all of the advertisements for cottages and for restaurants and things. And so I'm always finding really neat pieces of information, and this is one of them. So from the 1962 Eastham Handbook, in the old days, Nauset Beach, the Great Beach, or the backside of the Outer Cape Cod, was a dead lee shore with no haven of refuge during the northeast gales of winter. Once caught close inshore, ships were driven inexorably into the shifting, sandy shoals and tremendous winter surf. Many wrecks broke up within a few hours, and their crews perished from exposure or drowning. And so these photos, I was reading right from this little paragraph here. But here are a few photos from our archives to set the context for today's presentation. The Charles Campbell, and you'll notice the wagon that's gone to do some salvaging and the people beside it. The Messenger, which was wrecked again in the late 1800s. And it shows the effects of the might of the sea. The Katie Harding, again, salvagers are hanging around the bow, waiting to be able to get up there. And the Katie J. Barrett, all of these in the late 1800s. Here's a schooner off Orleans. I could not find out which schooner that was. And the Heraldine. And these are all, most of these are from Dawson's Lifesavers of Cape Cod, which is a wonderful, wonderful resource book. And I use it all the time. So here are the beachcombers waiting to strip a wrecked vessel. And they were patient, and then they would move in. I should tell you, all right, a little aside. In 1717, when the Whydah sunk, Captain Cyprian Southwick was sent by the governor of Massachusetts and said, get to that vessel before not the East, yeah, it was Eastham then, Easthamers do. And he was moored off Billingsgate, but he had a whaleboat on his ship, and he manned the oar, and he took 6 oarsmen with him, and the storm was so huge that it created a waterway passage from Jeremy's Creek up at the Orleans line all the way through to Town Cove and out to the ocean. And he made it to the Whydah, but not before the Eastham man. And all he found were the 122 bodies that he and his men had to bury. That's from another talk. But he drew a map of the Cape with all of those details on it. And if you've ever seen me speak, you know that I love maps. So this is the Castagna, 1914. We have the wheel of the Castagna in our museum. And a week and a half ago, a family came in, and I heard the father say, "It's here." And they were the son, daughter-in-law, and grandson of the woman and grandmother who had donated that wheel to us. And it was just amazing. And they still have the bell of the ship, but it's in their bar in Texas. And this is the Cape Ann that we have a really short 4-minute video that my aunt narrates, Dorcas Gill, about the Cape Ann. So the aftermath of some of the wrecks. And all of this is to say we needed some persons and institutions to help the people from the ships. There are many life-saving services at Nauset, and they started with the halfway houses, and then the Three Sisters Lighthouses, the U.S. Life-Saving Station, the French Cable Station, the new Nauset Light, the new Coast Guard Station. This is a chronological timeline of these things that I just mentioned. The later Three Sisters, which were wooden and more easily moved, which they had to be because of the encroachment of the sea on the bluffs of Nauset. The Cape Cod Canal was built in 1914, and that made a huge difference. And it was private, but it was opened during World War I to help. And then the U.S. Life-Saving Service became the U.S. Coast Guard. The new Nauset Light was moved up from Chatham. The new Coast Guard station replaced the old, and there's an interesting story about that. Nauset Light was painted red to help the day sailors distinguish it from others along the coast. The Coast Guard ended its service in 58, and the National Park Service came in 61 and took over that building. So this is in a nutshell, and now we'll go into some detail. From 1785 or 1787, the Mass Humane Society. And the Oracle back in 75 had a really nice article, and this was the drawing that was done for that article. I just really liked it. The society built humane huts, and by 1802, the first ones were at Nauset. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts formed the Humane Society as a charitable organization for, and I'm quoting, the recovery of persons who meet with such accidents as to produce in them the appearance of death. And to that end, they provide shelter along the outside beach of Cape Cod for seamen cast ashore from wrecked vessels. So 5 huts were built from Provincetown to Chatham. And Henry David Thoreau, when he walked the outer beach, called them charity huts. And altogether, they cost the society $192 for those 5 huts. And a Wellfleet historian, Everett Nye, said that they were small wooden buildings with fireplaces and other conveniences, and some person living in the vicinity by occasional visits would keep the huts in proper condition. So there was nothing organized. They relied on neighbors, and neighbors were few and far between along the backside of the shore. So besides the huts, though, they also built a special rescue boat. And it's not a super photograph. It's from a book in the library, and I didn't want to break the spine of the book to try and get the photo. But it was housed in Cohasset. And the cost for this boat was over $1,400, which was quite a sum in 1807. And more about this type of boat a little bit later. Other boats and huts were built, and these were 20 by 8.5 feet, and they were painted red for visibility. And by 1841, there were 81 stations, these small huts along the Massachusetts coast, with 18 boats and rescue equipment. The society requested of the selectmen of each town that would they please provide the volunteers to man them. And so they were all manned by volunteers. And this Humane Society is considered the parent of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Speaking of the boat, here is an article found in the archives, serendipitously. I wasn't looking for it. It was written it's a Noel Bile article. So he wrote it in the Cape Codder in 1999, but the picture is from the New Bedford Times, 1939. He was looking back 60 years. And it's an old Humane Society lifeboat that was uncovered at the base of the cliff after 70 years. And the reason they know what it was is because the 2 gentlemen in the middle of the photo, one is Captain Abbott Walker of Eastham. In 1939, he'd been a veteran of the Life-Saving Service for 30 years. And the other is Dan Gould of Orleans, and he'd been in the service since the 1870s. So they're the ones who knew what these boats would have had, which are the wooden gun. How do you pronounce that? Gun, that's what. Yeah, I used to say gunwales, and I knew that was wrong. And they had holes for oarlocks. They had airtight compartments in the bow and the stern. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. But this was 1939. And we're going to go back to 1838, 100 years earlier, to the first of the 3 sisters. Now, I have to tell you that these are not the first of the 3 sisters, because they didn't have photography back then. And the first ones were brick, and they were built. These are the second set, which were built in 1892. But I do, actually, I lied. I have a couple pictures of the early ones. Here they are. The bases of them that slid down the banking. Because the wooden ones were built on top of the older foundations. That was probably the only thing that was sturdy about them. There's a big hue and cry about the man who got the contract. He was the lowest bidder for building those first three. And it was, from what I gather from the archives documents, pretty shabby workmanship, and they weren't expected to last very long. Here is a favorite postcard that I love. They needed lights for the ships, but it was more for the fishermen, the smaller fishing vessels, more than any ocean-going ships. And the 3 towers were there so that fishermen could distinguish the coastline, which is very hard when you're out to sea, to know where you are, because it all looks the same and it curves around. So the 3 sisters are because Highland Light was a single light. That was the first lighthouse on the Cape. And Chatham Lights were 2 lights. And so they said, why do you need 3? Well, we need 3 so people know where they are. So they were 15 feet tall, 150 feet apart, and they used what was known as a Winslow Lewis lamp. And the keeper's house is also here. This is a favorite postcard, but I've cheated because I've cropped out a little bit of it, but you'll see that later. So the new wooden towers on the bases and the keeper's house again. And these were movable, and they were 22 feet high, and they were 30 feet away from the cliff. And they used the very same lights and lanterns that the original ones had. So they kept those and put them in here. Here's a postcard of all 3. They're identical. And they were called the 3 sisters because from the sea, because they were white and had the black metal tops, they looked like 3 women in white dresses with their black bonnets on. So the saying goes. This is a sketch from a book that I found in the library. And this is the beacon, which is, they named the lighthouses. And this is the external and the internal. There's not a lot of room here, but I kind of liked these sketches. And the beacon that was fitted with a Fresnel lens, and it was 3 rotations of the light every 10 seconds. And that's what I grew up with. And it was always, if you drove home after dark from Orleans to Eastham, when you came over the hill by Fort Hill, you would see the light, 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 and then a long pause. And I always remembered that. Nowadays, it's white, 4 seconds, red, 4 seconds, white, red. And I thought, when did that happen? Because I never remembered that. It was 1981 when I was away. And it was like, oh, okay. And so they got, in 1981, they got the red and white flash to match what they had done with the red and white lighthouse for the new one. And that'll come up later. I'll explain that. This is an old photo that I just love. It's a beautiful photo, and it's not in great, I think the reason that it's not in great shape is one of the reasons I love it so much. And here's another that I just adore, this photo of mother and 2 children with the 3 sisters in the background. And a colored postcard. I think someone should have proofread this. I'm an old English teacher and did lots of editing. the Nauset 3 lights in Northeast Ham, Mass, and the French cable landing place. Before we move on to the French cable station, a photo of Stephen Lewis, who was a longtime lighthouse keeper. He was at Highland Light before he was at Nauset Lights, and 40 years in the lighthouse service. Yeah, he resigned at 79 because of poor health. But it was a rather lonely job, but the keepers kept really busy. And here's a page from the log that Susan Abbott loaned to me so that I could use it. On the left-hand side are the days of the month and what the weather is, whether it's calm or a light breeze northeast to the colony or a light breeze northeast and fog, you know, whatever. On the right-hand side, on the particular days of the month, are the jobs that they did. So he painted, he whitewashed, he did the steps, he painted the floor of one tower and the door and the others. So it's a real record of the work that they had to do. And again, this is from Susan and the Nauset Light Preservation Society. So the U.S. Life Saving Service was formed, and Robert Finch, who I know you know because he's been a visitor and speaker here, and I've sung with him in the Outer Cape Chorale for many years. He wrote the book, the official National Park Handbook 148, about the Cape Cod National Seashore Park. It's out of print, but it is available online. And he said that a major step in aiding shipwreck victims was taken in 1872 when Congress established the U.S. Life Saving Service, a predecessor to today's Coast Guard. And all were manned almost entirely by local men. And I love their logo, and I love their motto. You have to go, but you don't have to come back. And they lived and died by this motto. So the Nauset Life Saving Station came into being in 1872. And I'm going to give you a little bit of history about why they decided they needed to form an official U.S. Life Saving Service. And this is according to Dalton's book, The Lifesavers of Cape Cod. So he says it was reorganized and extended for efficiency because before the 1870s, there were no drilled or disciplined crews, and there were irresponsible custodians, lack of equipment, pillage, and decay. And the Marine Revenue Service was charged with investigating the stations and with making a report. This is what they wrote in their report. Absolutely no discipline was found among the crews. No care had been taken of the apparatus. Some of the stations were in ruins. Others lacked such articles as powder, rockets, and shot lines. Every portable article had been stolen from many stations, and the money that Congress had appropriated had been practically wasted. So the need for reorganization. So the inefficient keepers were removed, and the most skilled boatmen were put in their place, the men who had manned the boats. The stations were manned by surfmen. Patrols of the coast at night were mandated, and during what they called thick weather, which is the foggy weather during the day. And the stations were supposed to be 5 miles apart. But here on the Cape, they were not. Consider the distance from Nauset down to Cocoon Hollow, which is the next one. That's more than 5 miles. They were too far apart for the crews of adjoining stations to help each other. And so they built some new stations, which were within 3.5 miles of each other. And if they couldn't build a new station, they would build a halfway house so that there was a place for their district. And the district was the station in the middle out to the halfway house, which would have been halfway between the next station. So they had that district. And then thus they could meet and work together. And they really had to, as you'll find out. So here's a map of, nope. Cape Cod. And the red dots are the lighthouses, not life-saving stations. And I have to tell you that there were 2 kinds of keepers. There were lighthouse keepers and life-saving station keepers. And so it's a little bit confusing sometimes when you're reading if you're not paying attention to which building or which entity they're talking about. But the lighthouses almost always had stations very nearby, close proximity. So you can see, I think the print is large enough, the 9 stations that were initially built from Monomoy to Race Point, and then 4 more were built along the outer beach. And then inside, Billingsgate Island, Mayo's Beach, and Sandy Neck had their lighthouses also, but not a life-saving station. Some details about the new stations. They were plain and painted red, as had been the Humane Society stations, but they were 42 feet long instead of 20, and they were 18 feet wide instead of 8.2. They had an observatory that you can see at the top of the peak of the roof, and they had a flagstaff 60 feet high, always, whoops, right beside it. And a very wide double-leafed doors with sloping platform to help the wagons and the boats get in and out easily. This is the structure that was in use until 1936 on the outer beach. So inside the station, they had a mess room and an apparatus room, and well, the crew, and then they had a sleeping room up above and a storeroom. And then their weekly schedule, and this was every week, every day. On Monday, you put the station in order. On Tuesday, you drilled launching and landing a lifeboat through the surf. And they had to be able to do this in record time. And they had to be able to do it without thinking about it. And they practiced and practiced and practiced. Wednesdays, they practiced the signal codes and the flag codes. Thursdays, they practiced with the beach apparatus and the breeches buoys. They practiced resuscitation on Fridays. They washed on Saturdays and washed their clothes and whatever. And Sunday was devoted to religious practice. And that's also when one of the surfmen would be able to go home and visit his family, because they lived here at the station. So this is Captain Alonzo in Burse and some of the surfmen in their mess room. He was the 3rd station keeper of Nauset Station, and he had grown up in Monomoy. So he knew the seas and he was out and about all the time. During the Civil War, He paused his life on the Cape and went to the Civil War and fought. And afterwards he came back and then became a surfman at Nauset, and then eventually the keeper. So the men in their white uniforms for a practice drill, and they always had a horse at the station. And so this is foul weather. It's raining, so they're in their foul weather gear, but they're bringing the horse out. If the horse ever got spooked, as it often did in a raging gale, then the horse would not go and the men would pull the wagon instead. Here they are, another drill. And I love this photo with the life-saving jackets that they're wearing. I can't imagine that they would do a lot of good, but I guess they did. They don't look very sturdy or floatable. I'm not going to go into the details of the life-saving because I'm focusing on the different institutions, but we in our museum at the schoolhouse have a life-saving section that explains all of this. And every Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock, if you go down to Old Harbor in Provincetown, they do a reenactment of the drill. It's wonderful, wonderful. And Dave and Marcia Bromley did a presentation for us, and it's just unbelievable. If you can ever get them to come here, it would be great. They're from East Ham. So here's a group photo in 1901, and the whole crew signed this photo. I just really loved it. And you'll recognize the names: Burse, Daniels, Howes, Mayo, Gill, Collins, Higgins, Snow. The Nauset crew. And the crews work together. There are lots of pictures of the Nauset and the Wellesley crews, or the Nauset, and when they got together, if they had someone with a photo, and they were mostly in the 1900s. So the day and watch night patrols are really interesting. During the day, they would just use the lookout or some area of the shore that had a good view up on one of the dunes or something. But as I said, during night and foggy or thick weather, then they had to go out. So the night patrol was divided into 4 watches, and each watch required 2 surfmen. I think I have a picture of the hut. The hut has telephone poles behind it. That's because in the 1920s, the huts were fitted with telephones, and the keeper of the life-saving service would be informed by telephone from the keeper of another station whether there was a wreck offshore or not. And so that really helped. And that's in part, I think, because of the French cable station, which we're coming up to. But I love this sketch, and it's from Dalton's book. So the surfmen would set out at the same time in opposite directions. One would head to the south, for East Ham at least, south to the next station, and the other would head north to the next station. And their goal was the halfway house. And they had to meet up with the surfmen of the other station who had left at the same time. They had to walk as close to the water as they could walk and keep a lookout on the ocean horizon. And they had little checks that they had to exchange and then take back to their respective stations to prove that they had met up with the other man. And if the other surfman didn't show up, the one surfman had to wait. And then he would, or if he still didn't show up, he would continue on to the next station to find out what had happened to him, or if he was there, or what had happened. And they would have to report this failure to meet, and every night. And so some of them had a time clock, and the time clock was opened by a key, and the key was kept on a post at the halfway house. So you had to get to the halfway house to get the key to unlock the clock, to punch your time that yes, you had been there. There were so many checks and balances. It was really interesting to me. And so they also had forms to fill out. So they had to write about the condition of the surf, and they just had to make tick marks for that at midnight, sunrise, noon, and sunset. The direction and the force of the wind at each time, the barometer, and they had to say who went from where to what station, who they met, whether the house was clean, whether it was in good repair, was any member of the crew absent on liberty, who, what, from what hour to what hour, so it just, and what kind of boats or ships they saw, whether it was a bark or a brig or a schooner or a steamer or whatever. And this was daily, the records that they had to keep. They also carried what's known as a Coston signal, and they're holding it in their hand, and this is it. It's a flare with a bright red light from it. And this is the check I was talking about up here that they, traded with the other guy. But the Coston's signal was for two reasons. If they saw a vessel and they thought it was in trouble, it was to let them know, we see you, we're coming. If they saw a vessel and they didn't think it was in trouble, but it was headed this way, haul off, get out of here if you can, don't come any closer. And everyone knew that when the men on the ship would see that red flash, and it was very, very bright, that they had to take care. And then that was the signal also for all the other men from the different services to join at that point to see what would happen. So the next drills are postcards that show pictures of the drills. So here they are. The horse obviously is not with them, so they're carrying the boat down to the shore. And this is a calm day, and this is at Nauset, and they're doing their drill. So it must be a Tuesday, I think. Here they are using the breeches buoy and the Lyle gun. And this is the breeches buoy. There's someone in there, and they're going to have him go up from here. He'd be coming in this direction. And this is the Lyle gun, which would fire the shot that would get the line to the ship, a process that they were very, very adept with. And another postcard showing the breeches buoy and the Lyle gun and the practice. This is later on. This is a crew once it became the Coast Guard. And this is Captain Abbott right here. And he's working on the faking box. These are members of the Eastham crew. And this gentleman is a really, really good family friend. We called him Grandpa Rongner, but it's Ingwe Rongner, who was the commander of the life-saving service, and his son, George Rongner, also became the captain. But this is nice weather, and of course, this one is not so nice. But they went out no matter the weather. So they had to launch the ship, the lifeboat, and the captain was always the last one in the lifeboat. And he's always the one at the oar that did the steering of it also. And if you can see, this is the Nauset boat, and they're wearing those life-saving vests. And it's just amazing. Here they are in a winter surf. Again, the Nauset. And this is the last picture that we have of the life-saving station that was painted white in the 1930s, just before it they built the new station. So I believe we're going to move on to the French cable station. Now, this was built at Nauset in 1879, and it was just such a desolate place. It came from Duxbury, where the first cable had been laid, and it was rough coastline. It was hard to get to. Cable Road is named Cable Road because it ended at the cable station. Just used to be known as Town Road or something like that. And it was a two-story station, but it was very difficult in Eastham. It later became a hotel for a couple of years, but they moved to, oh, and this is the crew. It's an 1881 photograph of the French cable station. Many of them are Eastham men, John Smart, Dills, Williams, Quinns, Halls, Gills. The men of the French cable station were not French. They were not from France. They were trained in England and worked the stations over here. And then they moved to, oh, there it is, my favorite postcard, showing the proximity of the French cable station. And I just love that. And they were all right along that shore. It must have been beautiful to see if the weather was nice and you were in a boat out on the water. But the new station was built in 1891. So the one in Eastham didn't last very long. And they moved the equipment and the men to Orleans. It's the Cable Station Museum in Orleans now. And this is when it was under construction. And it remained in operation until 1959. The cable was actually pulled through Town Cove from east and then up into the station. We have some old photos of the guys trying to literally pull that cable up through the muck and guck of Town Cove to where it is now. And it was closed down, not in service, during World War II for security reasons. And this was it, from France to Orleans. It was called Le Direct. And it was 3,200 miles long. And we can thank them for a lot of communications capabilities over here. So the new Coast Guard station, 1936. It was commissioned by Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. And some of his fellow picnickers on a vacation here, because he summered here, there was a summer thunderstorm and they had to take refuge. And they took refuge in the life-saving station. And he thought it was in such pitiful condition that he went back to Washington, lobbied whoever he had to lobby, and the next year they started construction on this one. And he came down in the summer to check on its progress in 1936. So here are some of the photos of the Coast Guard station in the early days. And the cottages, because this is where the booth is for the park. And then you would drive up this road here, which was non-existent. This looks like a volleyball net back there. All of these cottages have been moved, the fish house, and one of them's across the street from my house now. And the parking, I think I have a photo. Oh, here are the cottages again. And this is in the 60s of the station from what we know as Ocean View Drive. I took this picture at the end of one of my shifts, giving tours at the Lighthouse last summer. And it was a gray and foggy day. And we had so many people that wanted to go up in that lighthouse. I don't know, we had 200 and something visitors that day. And I was like, ah. And I was driving home, and as I came over the hill, as I always do, I just went, ah. You know, it was just, I love that view. I loved the surf. I didn't mind the telephone poles. But there were no cottages there. And this is what we see today. This is last summer. Postcards of the lighthouse and the Coast Guard station. And the Nauset light, the first one was white, and it came from Chatham. And they dismantled it and then brought it up here by truck. And it's one of their twin towers, which they no longer needed. And it was 200 feet from the cliff. And they added in the Fresnel lens. And that's as they were getting it ready. This is it before 1940. Note this little fence that goes along the front. We'll see that in several other photos. Here it is post 1940, and the top half is now red as a day marker for the fishermen because the lights they used at night. And the lights still flashed white at 3-second intervals. This is the parking lot at Nauset Beach, 1940. I love it. No lines, just sand. A couple, you know, guard posts up there. Bob's Doghouse, remember? At Nauset Beach, he used propane gas and cooked hot dogs, especially for people. His doghouse is right here, right on the cliff, and the stairs to the beach went straight down. The parking lot grew. This is the parking lot now. This is Bob's Doghouse. The light that used to be here is now here. This is the 50s and 60s. Here's one of the Three Sisters. It might be part of the Beacon. New York Ballet. Students lived there in summer times. Here's that little row of posts in front. It's a road that led all the way up towards Marconi. 1965. Here's Bob's Doghouse. But the parking lot has been expanded a lot, and extra parking on the other side of the road. Getting closer to the edge, or the edge is getting closer to it, because that didn't move. This is the early 1990s. Keep your eye on this little house. It won't be there for long. Here is one of the bases of the Three Sisters down on the beach. 1993, it was about 50 feet from the cliff. Susan Abbott let me have these photos to use. And this is when they realized they really had to do something about it. So they started the Preservation Society for Nauset Light, and they started raising money. So the erosion, this is a newspaper article from 1996 that shows the light with the house in 1961 and the light in 1996, 35 years later. Yeah, it was amazing. Erosion, we used to tell the people on the tours, was about 4 to 6 feet every year. But between 2012 and 2016, I think it was 44 feet. There were many storms, those in 4 years, just amazing. And so the Society, Nauset Light Preservation Society, in November, they moved the light in 1996. And lots of Eastham people showed up. My mom showed up, loads of people showed up. And they started on a Friday morning here. I drew in the red line, but this is a composite of photos taken from the air. Sherm Lovering, who gave tours there for years and years, lent me these, gave them to me. Friday afternoon, the lighthouse was here. Saturday, during the day, morning, afternoon, evening, and finally Sunday, up to its final resting place where it is now. This is from Susan Abbott. If you were here for her talk, you may have seen it. It's unbelievable. The three sisters are along this yellow line out here. This is the 1960 beach parking lot in pink. Here are the three sisters. The edge of the cliff, the parking lots, the current location, and the three sisters' current location. So it's just amazing. I like this picture taken in 97, 98, right after it was moved. This is from Sherm, and I love it. I think it was during Windmill Weekend, and they drove out there in their jalopy. I took this at a road race. I wasn't racing, but I was cheering on my brothers, and I took a little side trip because it was a foggy-ish day. This is giving tours, and in these two little portholes, you can see my great niece and my great nephew. It was their first time at the light, and they climbed all the way to the top with their Grammy, who's my twin sister. Then they came down and just loved it. 44 steps up to the top. And of course, Cape Cod potato chips have really helped out financially and supported the light. And erosion, this was last summer. I loved the Adirondack chairs up here on the edge of the cliff, and I caught it with the white light, not the red light in the photo. So these are the sources that I used, and I just thank you so much for your attention today. It was really enjoyable for me to relive this. Thanks.